Hello, my name is Brian Carey Sims, and I'm Executive Director at JomoWorks, where our mission is to connect resources and energy from higher education with K-12 students, teachers, and their communities. The title of this mini-course is Social Media Research Dissemination. This course is designed to emphasize the role and value of social media in disseminating research findings. The primary objective of the course is to help individuals conceptualize, design, conduct, frame, and share their research in such a way as to maximize the social element and leverage the ever-evolving technological landscape of social media. I'm also a proud member of IRL's second, and if I'm being honest, best cohort. Shout out to Team Guilford County, and hope that this course will help IRL teams to appreciate the potential of social media to generate scientific discourse in contemporary life, analyze social media posts using measures from dissemination science and business analytics, design an effective Twitter campaign based on their research project's goals, identify and connect with those audiences relevant to your research agenda, and effectively include social media research dissemination plans in research funding proposals. Now, one of the goals of the IRL program, and in fact all of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation initiatives around a culture of health and leadership, is for fellows to use social media strategically as one component of your multi-pronged efforts to have impact and action resulting from your work. Social media offers a world of advantages to the research community. Over the last 10 years, research dissemination plans have gone from supplemental materials to a requirement in many RFPs. That's because today, one tweet can do more for a publication than an entire book review could from back in the day. Increasingly, social media has taken a central role in these plans as researchers strive to find new ways to reach their audiences beyond the peer-reviewed manuscript. And this cartoon, for me, really captures a lot about social media research dissemination. This guy is basically slanging journal articles on the street, which for me is a poignant commentary on the perceived shift from traditional dissemination venues to online and digital outlets. It's also relevant to me that his customers are elderly. So what you essentially see is an inversion of the usual sorts of ways or the way that we've thought about communication and information in a general sense. Now, much of this course builds on an earlier mini course on the use of evidence in policymaking by Dr. Sarah Gallus, the Associate Professor and Associate Director of Robert Wood Johnson Foundation IRL Division of Health Policy and Management. In part 5 of Dr. Gallus' course, she asks, what about social media? And discussed the value that social media has as a tool for disseminating evidence for action. I highly recommend, if you haven't already, that you check out part 5 of her mini course for some really crucial information and perspective on how social media can really help your research build momentum and have an impact on policymakers and influences. In some ways, this course is a kind of social media for policymaking 2.0, but I also want to get more psychological about social media itself in order to allow you, the researcher or community partner, to think differently about what dissemination actually means. This course is designed for researchers willing to think beyond the peer-reviewed journal article and embrace the world of digital social media possibilities for research dissemination. For example, one of the points that Dr. Gallus made in the mini course on the use of social media for policy making and translation was that researchers generally have not really embraced social media at all. Her work found that researcher attitudes towards social media dissemination were significantly less favorable than attitudes towards traditional media and direct outreach efforts. Now, this is fascinating to me because I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Florida A&M University, where my African Media Psychology lab studies the psychological implications of media for people of African descent. So I'd like to get this party started with a psychological discussion of the actual function of media in society itself. I'd argue that the reason that researchers have been slow to view social media as effective and legitimate and have seen it as less beneficial for academic promotion, I'd argue that reason has more to do with Western society and the roles, values, functions, and uses of media in contemporary global societies itself. Now, in my work, I tend to describe individual, family, and community behaviors and outcomes like health equity using the language and frameworks of colonialism, incarceration, and systematic racism and white supremacy. Now, for many, even mentioning these concepts is uncomfortable and anxiety-provoking. However, many scholars have linked colonialism, education, and ideology to articulate the problems in society. Of course, each of these concepts has many definitions, but I think most would agree that at a basic level, colonialism has something to do with control or exploitation. The stories we were taught in second grade social studies about the early American colonies revolting against the British comes to mind here. Education has a lot to do with socialization as well. Education is required to establish social roles, places, and functions, and to organize and standardize that information of worldviews being disseminated. That brings us to ideas. Ideology is important. Ideology is not left to chance. The manipulation of a community's governing ideas, its ideology, is essential to the process of colonialism. And that's where media comes in. Many thinkers define media as ideology. In order to colonize or control, powerful people and institutions use education and media to disseminate their ideas to manage the consciousness of the people. Let's quickly look at 3 examples from my work on media's psychological implications for people of African descent. The first comes from 2012. I was fortunate to lead a group of students to Malawi for a summer study abroad. We landed in Lilongwe, the capital of Malawi, and as we walked out of the airport, we saw this convenience store, this Metro Cash and Carry, right across the street from the terminal. Now, this was my very first trip to the continent, and I know it sounds silly now, I admit, but at the time I was filled with these lofty, sort of fantastic notions of Africa having all these positive images of blackness until we walked in and saw this. Note the smiling, carefree, energetic visuals of whiteness. This newspaper stand with magazines was literally right as you first stepped into the store. The only visuals of blackness, if you notice, are marginalized to the perimeter and on the ground. And these portray Africans and their leadership under duress and ensconced in scandal. The second comes from Greensboro, North Carolina. These are the newspapers that you could see that are actually on the bottom of the newspaper stand. So the second example comes from Greensboro, North Carolina, home to both North Carolina A&T State University, a proud HBCU, and the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, affectionately known as UNCG, each institution deeply embedded in the fabric and lifeblood of the region. Shooting was reported on the campus of UNCG. A white suspect was identified, as was a single white victim. Here's local news coverage that aired the day of the incident. Note how, despite the reality of a white suspect on a majority college campus, the news media's focus is pejorative and racially oriented in an attack on the HBCU. Tim Wise, author of Colorblind, reported that the more news one watches, local or national, the more likely one is to negatively stereotype black folks. The effect of the news on racist attitudes is independent of pre-existing racial views, gender, age, education levels, political ideology, income, levels of neighborhood diversity, and even for the crime in one's own neighborhood. In other words, watching the news accounts for about 25% of all negative stereotypes about black folks. The third case study comes from Tallahassee, Florida. Here is an image of a rather popular billboard located on Tallahassee's south side in the heart of the black community. I was astonished when I saw it, and I still remember the day, not so much by the imagery, as Slick Rick once said, this type of thing happens every day, but by the audacity of a company to actually come right out and refer to as a black man as a thug on a billboard. I'd later find out from my millennial students that Young Thug is a music recording artist, and well, that picture is him. More on this later. The very next day, I noticed this billboard located at on the same side of Orange Avenue, a block east of the Young Thug billboard. This billboard reads, "Gun violence hurts everyone, help us stop it," and features a revolver. Now, here's a photo that I took with my cell phone. I don't have the time to go into the science of visual perception and subliminal imagery here, but let me just point out that corporations use visuals to send messages as a matter of course, many without the conscious appreciation of the message behind the logo by the viewer. Logos, for example, cleverly communicate brand messages to millions of unaware potential customers. Note here the striking similarities between these two billboards. The message, albeit subtle, is clear. Black men are the violent perpetrators of gun violence and need to be stopped by an external force. Now, social media is perceived less favorably by researchers, trained gatekeepers of the status quo, because of its potential for new power dynamics, norms, and ideology. Social media research dissemination is the applied science of connecting the research and academic communities with teachers, parents, patients, students, policymakers, and consumers, real people, those individuals, families, and communities impacted by scientific progress and discovery. Put simply, social media represents a potential threat to power structures that contribute to and maintain inequity, undermine diversity, and resist inclusion. This is great news for researchers and community advocates looking to effect change and build a culture of health. One of the enduring lessons from this last case study is that social media, like society, is ever evolving, and that, like it or not, young people are in the driver's seat. This generation's experiences and understandings of health and leadership and poverty and education must be included and prioritized if we're going to be effective at using research to make change. Toward that end, this mini course will also include some of the experiences of young people who have experienced supporting researchers' efforts to disseminate their work using social media through the Social Media Research Dissemination Initiative, or SMRDI. Through the SMRDI, we've unlocked the power and infinite potential of social media to reach new audiences with research findings. Here are some photos of some of the undergraduates who are working as social media representatives today at North Carolina Central University. They're sparking new conversations and access to reimagine the function and process of research in solving problems in the social, behavioral, health equity, and education arenas. I hope you'll stick around for part 2, where we'll look at different social media platforms and help figure out which types of social media work best for your research goals.